On the first night of January 1940, in a forest in eastern Finland, a Soviet division was strung out along a single narrow road, and it was already dead. It did not know that yet. The men only knew that they were cold in a way that human beings are not built to survive, that the temperature had fallen toward 40 below, and that the road they had been ordered to advance along ran arrow straight through deep forest and frozen lakes with no room to spread out, and nowhere to go but forward or back. Down the length of the column, freezing Ukrainian soldiers had built roaring fires from logs, standing close to the flames just to stay alive. Those fires were a mistake. 400 yards away, in the black tree line at the edge of the road, Finnish soldiers dressed head to toe in white lay in the snow and watched them. The fires told the Finns exactly where the enemy was. In a few hours, they would come out of the forest on skis, cut the road in front of the column and behind it, and begin taking the trapped division apart, one piece at a time. The division on the road was the Soviet 44th, and it numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men, with tanks, artillery, and hundreds of vehicles. The Finns who were about to destroy it numbered a few thousand. Within a week, the 44th Division would essentially cease to exist. Its commander would be taken back to the Soviet Union and shot. This is the story of how a small force of Finnish reservists on skis annihilated a Soviet division on a frozen forest road, why the road that was supposed to carry an invasion became a death trap instead, and how the terrain and the cold did what no army that size should ever have allowed to happen. To understand the road, you have to understand how badly the odds were stacked against the country defending it. In late November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. Joseph Stalin had demanded that the Finns hand over territory near the city of Leningrad, which sat close to the border, and the Finns had refused. So the Soviet Union simply took what it wanted by force. It was one of the most lopsided invasions imaginable. The Soviet Union had a population of well over 150 million people and one of the largest armies on Earth. Finland had a population of under 4 million. The Red Army came across the border with hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, and thousands of aircraft. Soviet planners expected the whole thing to be over in a couple of weeks, and there were expectations in Moscow of a quick victory to be delivered in time for Stalin's 60th birthday in December. The Finns had almost none of the things a country is supposed to have to survive an invasion like this. Very few tanks, very little artillery, no great power coming to save them. What they had instead was their country itself, and a particular kind of stubborn will the Finns call sisu, and soldiers who had grown up in these forests and could live and move and fight in a winter that killed people who did not know it. One of the main Soviet thrusts drove into the center of Finland, aimed at a small town called Suomussalmi. The plan behind it was ambitious and, on a map, deadly. If the Soviets could push through Suomussalmi and reach the city of Oulu on the west coast, they would cut Finland completely in half at its narrow waist and sever the rail link that carried supplies in from neutral Sweden. Cut there, and the Finnish war might collapse. 2 Soviet divisions were committed to making it happen. The men who would have to stop them were a scratch force of local reservists. The Soviet advance on Suomussalmi began well, and that was the beginning of the disaster. The 1st Soviet division into the area, the 163rd, pushed across the border and drove on the town. There was very little to stop it at first. The Finns in the sector were badly outnumbered, and the Soviets took Suomussalmi in early December. On a map in Moscow, it looked like the plan was working, but the Finns had done something before they left. They had evacuated the townspeople and burned the town, so that the Soviets who captured it found not shelter and supplies, but a scorched, empty ruin in the middle of a frozen wilderness. The 163rd Division had taken its objective and gained nothing. It now sat in a burned-out village, deep inside enemy territory, at the end of a long and fragile supply line running back to the border along a single road. Then the Finns cut that road. In the middle of December, they severed the Raate Road behind the 163rd, and then cut its other supply route as well. In a matter of days, the division that had captured Suomussalmi went from being a spearhead to being a prisoner. It was isolated, low on food and fuel, freezing, and surrounded by an enemy it could rarely even see. And into the forests around it came the man who would make the whole campaign a textbook, a Finnish colonel named Hjalmar Siilasvuo, a veteran of the First World War, gathering his reservists to destroy the trapped Soviets before they could be rescued. Over the last days of December, Siilasvuo closed the trap on the 163rd and crushed it. Cut off, starving, and freezing, the division was attacked from the forest and broken apart, and when it finally tried to escape, it did so in the worst possible way. The The survivors fled north out onto the open ice of a frozen lake, where there was no cover of any kind, and there the Finnish guns caught them in the open. Men and vehicles were destroyed on the bare ice in full view, and the wreckage and the dead were left frozen where they fell. The Finns retook the ruins of Suomussalmi at the end of December. The first of the 2 Soviet divisions sent to cut Finland in half had been destroyed, but a rescue was already on the way. When Moscow understood that the 163rd was in trouble, it ordered a second, stronger division to drive up the Raate Road and save it. That division was the 44th, and the road it was ordered to take would become the most famous killing ground of the entire war. Everything about the Battle of the Raate Road comes down to the road itself, so it is worth understanding exactly what it was. The Raate Road was not a highway. It was a narrow logging track cut through dense subarctic forest, running from the Soviet border towards Suomussalmi. On either side of it lay deep, snow-choked woods and frozen lakes, ground that a man on skis could cross but that a truck or a tank could not. In the winter of 1939, the snow was deep enough that anything on wheels or tracks was confined to the road. There was no spreading out into attack formation, no maneuvering off to the flanks. There was the road, and there was forward, and there was back. Onto this single track, the Soviet High Command fed an entire mechanized division. The 44th came up the Raate Road with its tanks, its guns, its trucks, its horses, and thousands of men, and as it advanced it stretched out into a column that ran for something like 20 to 30 kilometers along the road. Nose to tail, a single enormous snake of vehicles and troops on a track barely wide enough for one tank at a time. Some accounts note that the division even brought a motorized brass band, ready to play for the victory parade the Soviets expected to hold in Oulu. That column was the target, and the men who would attack it had every advantage the situation could give a defender. The Finns were on skis, which meant they could move silently and fast through the deep forest the Soviets could not enter. They wore white camouflage that made them nearly invisible against the snow, while the Soviet troops in their darker uniforms stood out like ink on paper. They knew this ground because many of them had grown up on it, and they had one more advantage that mattered enormously. The Soviets were sending radio messages without proper encryption, and the Finns were listening, which meant they often knew what the 44th was going to do before it did it. A mechanized division is a powerful thing in open country where it can maneuver. Strung out in single file on a forest road in the dead of a Finnish winter, it was something else entirely. It was a line of men and machines that could be cut anywhere along its length and could not fight its way out. The Finns had a word for what they were about to do to it. There was a deeper reason the Soviets could not simply adapt their way out of the trap, and it is part of why this battle is still taught. The Red Army of 1939 had been gutted by Stalin's purges of its own officer corps in the preceding years, which had killed or imprisoned a huge share of its experienced commanders and left many units led by men afraid to show initiative. Soviet doctrine was built around mass, around big formations advancing together with tanks and artillery in concentrated force. That doctrine was deadly in the open, on a narrow forest track where the formation could not form, where initiative at the small unit level was everything, and where survival depended on adapting fast to an enemy you could not see. It was close to useless. The 44th Division was not just badly placed. It was fighting in exactly the conditions its whole way of war was worst suited to, against an enemy fighting in exactly the conditions its way of war was best suited to. The Finnish tactic that destroyed the 44th Division has a name, and the name explains the method. The word is Motti, and in Finnish it refers to a stack of firewood, a bundle of logs cut and piled for burning. That is precisely what the Finns did to the Soviet column. Rather than attacking the entire division at once, which their small numbers could never have managed, they cut the long road-bound column into segments. Ski troops came out of the forest, struck a point on the road, and blocked it, felling trees across the track and mining the blockages. Then they cut the road again somewhere else. Each cut isolated a section of the column between two roadblocks, a pocket of trapped Soviet troops with forest on both sides, enemy ahead and enemy behind. Each of those pockets was a Motti, a stack of logs, and then, at leisure, the Finns destroyed them one at a time. This is the heart of why a few thousand men could annihilate a division. The Finns never had to fight the whole 44th at once. They only ever had to fight the piece of it they had chosen to attack, while the rest of the division sat frozen and immobile in its own separate pockets, unable to come to each other's aid, unable to leave the road, unable even to see the enemy in the trees. The Finns picked the time and place of every fight. They struck, they melted back into the forest on their skis, and they came again somewhere else. The Soviet soldiers, road-bound and blind, could do almost nothing but wait to be attacked. And while the Finns cut the division apart, a second enemy was killing the Soviets around the clock, one that never rested and could not be fought at all. The systematic destruction of the 44th began in earnest on the night of the 1st of January 1940, and the opening blow shows exactly how it worked. A Finnish battalion, around 1,000 well-fed and well-equipped men under a lieutenant named Lasila, moved through the forest to a start line only about 400 yards from the road. From there, in the darkness, they could see the fires. The Ukrainian soldiers of the 44th, freezing in the open, had built up roaring log fires to keep from dying of the cold, and those fires lit them up as targets in the black winter night. The Finns set up machine guns on either side of the stretch of road they meant to attack, positioned to seal off the edges of the gap. Then the infantry charged out of the trees, the machine guns opened fire, and combat engineers went to work felling trees across the road to block it. The attack cut a clean gap in the column and split it. This became the pattern for everything that followed. By the next morning, Finnish troops held strong blocking positions, reinforced with mines, at several points in the middle of the long Soviet column, chopping it into separate, trapped pieces. The decisive general attack was ordered for the 5th of January, focused on a place called Haukila, a dozen kilometers east of Suomussalmi, where the largest concentration of Soviet troops had bunched up. From the 5th to the 7th of January, the Finns systematically reduced the pockets, and the 44th Division came apart. The Soviets did not simply give up, they fought, and some of their attempts to break the noose were desperate and brave. They tried to smash through the Finnish roadblocks with their tanks, throwing armor forward in frontal attacks up the narrow track. But a tank on a single-lane forest road, unable to maneuver, facing mined roadblocks and men with explosives who could come out of the trees and disappear again, is not the weapon it is in open country. The tanks were destroyed or stopped, and the roadblocks held. Finnish ski troops slipped up to individual tanks and killed them with firebombs. Soviet sentries posted at night were found dead or simply gone by morning, taken by an enemy no one had heard coming. The forest belonged to the Finns, and everything that happened in it happened on their terms. The psychological effect of this on the trapped Soviet soldiers is hard to overstate. They could not see the enemy. They could not predict where the next attack would come from. They put out guards at night and found them dead in the snow at dawn, with no shot heard and no sign of a struggle. They stood by fires that they knew marked them for death, but that they could not do without. And in the pockets nearest to Suomussalmi, the men of the 44th could hear the fighting to their west, the sound of the 163rd Division being destroyed only a couple of miles ahead of them, close enough that the shooting carried through the forest. They were listening to their own future, and their commander did not come to the rescue of the division dying within earshot, nor could he save his own. The cold, meanwhile, was doing its own work, and it never stopped. To understand the scale of what happened on the Raate Road, you have to reckon with the cold, because the cold was killing the 44th Division as surely as the Finns were. The winter of 1939 into 1940 was brutally severe, even by the standards of a country used to hard winters. Temperatures on the Raate Road fell toward 30 and even 40 degrees below zero. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal tears at bare hands, and a man who cannot get warm and stay warm will die. The Finns were built and equipped for it. They had white winter clothing in layers. They knew how to move and shelter in it, and they could rotate back to warm quarters. The Soviet soldiers of the 44th, many of them conscripts from the warmer farmlands of Ukraine, had been sent into an Arctic winter without adequate winter gear, without skis, and without the knowledge to survive the environment they had been dropped into. The result was that the cold became a weapon on the Finnish side. Trapped in their pockets along the road, unable to move, running short of food and fuel, the men of the 44th froze. Frostbite took fingers, feet, and whole limbs. Men who lay down froze where they lay. Hunger weakened them further. The fires they built to survive marked them for the snipers and the machine guns. It is one of the grimmest facts of this battle that a large share of the Soviet dead were not killed in the fighting at all. They were killed by the temperature, by an enemy that gave no warning and accepted no surrender, while they waited on a road they could not leave. This is not a thing to be celebrated, and a serious account should not pretend otherwise. The men dying in the snow were, for the most part, ordinary conscripts who had been marched into a catastrophe by commanders who had put them somewhere no army should ever have gone. Their destruction was a military achievement of a very high order by the Finns, and it was also a horror. By the 6th and 7th of January, the 44th Division was finished as a fighting force, and its end came in a way that made everything worse for the men caught in it. The division's commander, General Alexei Vinogradov, had been slow to act throughout. He had never made a serious attempt to break through and rescue the 163rd Division, which had been destroyed only a couple of miles away, close enough that his men could hear the shooting. And when his own division was being cut to pieces around him, he waited too long to save it. It was only late in the evening of the 6th of January, at around 9:30, that Vinogradov finally gave the order to abandon the road and retreat to the Soviet border. By then it was far too late to be an orderly retreat. It became a rout. The surviving Soviet troops abandoned their tanks, their guns, their vehicles, and their wounded, and fled on foot into the forest and out across the ice of the frozen lakes, trying to reach the border. The Finns were waiting on the escape routes. Men were cut down as they ran across the open ice. The great column of the 44th Division dissolved into scattered groups of freezing, terrified men trying to survive a wilderness that most of them did not survive. Of the division that had come up the road, only a fraction ever made it back to Soviet lines, and many of those who did were maimed by frostbite. The equipment of an entire modern division was left behind on the Raate Road, frozen into the snow. When it was over, the cost and the scale of the Finnish victory were staggering. And here the record requires honesty, because the numbers are fiercely disputed. The exact number of Soviet dead on the Raate Road and around Suomussalmi will never be known with certainty. The Soviet government, at the time, claimed it had lost only around 1,000 men, most to frostbite. Finnish estimates ran vastly higher, on the order of 7,000 to 9,000 killed on the Raate Road alone, with more than 1,000 taken prisoner, and figures for the two Soviet divisions destroyed at Suomussalmi together have been put anywhere from around 13,000 to over 20,000 dead and missing. The memorial that stands on the battlefield today makes the honest admission that no one is able to count the exact number of Red Army lives lost. What is not in dispute is that two Soviet divisions were effectively annihilated, and that the 44th in particular was almost entirely destroyed, for Finnish losses that were a small fraction of that, on the order of a few hundred killed on the Raate Road. The material haul was almost as significant as the human one. The Finns captured a fortune in equipment from the wreck of the 44th Division. The exact tallies vary between sources, but they run to dozens of tanks, dozens of artillery pieces, and anti-tank guns, hundreds of trucks, well over 1,000 horses, and thousands of rifles and machine guns, along with mountains of ammunition. For a Finnish army desperately short of weapons, the destruction of the 44th was also a resupply. The Finns took Soviet equipment off the road and turned it against its former owners. The victory also traveled far beyond the forest. The Raate Road was one of the first battlefields the Finnish authorities allowed foreign war correspondents to visit, and what those reporters saw, a road and a frozen lake littered for miles with the wrecked machines and frozen dead of an entire Soviet division, produced images that went around the world. In the winter of 1940, with a great power humiliated by a tiny neighbor, the story of Suomussalmi became an international sensation. It embarrassed the Soviet Union badly, it fed a wave of sympathy for Finland, and it planted a dangerous idea in the minds of observers watching from Berlin, that the Red Army was a hollow giant that could be beaten. That impression would help encourage a far larger invasion of the Soviet Union a year and a half later, and it would prove catastrophically wrong on that scale. But in the winter of 1940, on the Raate Road, it looked entirely true. For General Vinogradov, there was a final, bitter accounting. Held responsible for the destruction of his division and the loss of its equipment, he was taken back across the border, court-martialed, and executed, along with members of his staff, some accounts say, in front of the survivors of the very division he had lost. There is a cruelty inside that punishment that the record notes plainly. The 44th had been ordered by the Soviet High Command to advance and hold on that road in the first place. The men at the top, who had sent the division to its death on the Raate Road, shot the commander who had been forced to obey them. The Raate Road became one of the most studied battles of the 20th century, and it is worth being clear about both what it proved and what it did not. What it proved is that mass is not the same as strength. The Soviet mechanized division, larger and far better armed than the force that destroyed it, was annihilated because it was put in a place where its size and its machines became liabilities instead of advantages. On a single forest road in deep snow, its tanks could not maneuver, its column could not concentrate, and its men could not survive the cold. A small force that understood the terrain, moved better through it, struck where it chose, and let the environment do half the killing, took that division apart. Foreign war correspondents, allowed to see the frozen battlefield, sent images of it around the world, and the phrase they used was a frozen hell. Military academies have studied the encirclement ever since as a model of what well-led, well-adapted troops can do to a larger enemy who has surrendered the advantages of the ground. The Finns themselves understood exactly what they had built, and they refined it into a system for the rest of the war. The word Motti became Doctrine. Specialist officers were assigned to the reduction of the pockets, and the whole approach, cut the road, trap the column, isolate the enemy into stacks, and destroy them at leisure while the cold and hunger did their part, was repeated against other Soviet columns on other roads through that winter. The Raate Road was the clearest and most complete example, but it was not an accident or a fluke. It was a method, and it was a method that turned Finland's greatest weaknesses, its small numbers and its lack of heavy equipment, into something close to irrelevant, by refusing to fight the war the enemy wanted to fight. What it did not do was win the war. This is the harder truth, and the honest place to end. The victory at Suomussalmi and on the Raate Road was one of the most complete battlefield triumphs of the entire conflict, but Finland was too small and too alone to win a long war against the Soviet Union. Elsewhere, on the Karelian Isthmus, the Red Army eventually reorganized under new commanders, learned from its early humiliations, brought its enormous weight of men and guns to bear, and broke through the main Finnish defenses by sheer force in February 1940. Finland was compelled to make peace in March, ceding a large piece of its territory, the region of Karelia, to the Soviet Union. Tens of thousands of Finns had died, and the country lost land that hundreds of thousands of its people had to abandon. But it kept the one thing that mattered most. It kept its independence. Finland was never conquered, never occupied, never made into a Soviet republic, and a large part of the reason the Soviets were willing to settle for territory rather than press on to swallow the whole country was the memory of what fighting the Finns had cost them, in places like the Raate Road. There is one small human detail from that road that says more about the battle than any casualty figure. A Soviet political officer later remembered a simple Ukrainian peasant soldier, one of the men being marched up that road towards Suomussalmi, stopping to ask him a question. The soldier wanted to know why they were fighting this war at all. They had been told the Soviet Union wanted no one else's land. Now here they were, far from home, in a frozen forest. As the soldier put it, for what? I do not understand. Most of the men who marched up the Raate Road never got an answer, and never came home. Today a field of thousands of stones stands on that ground, one intended for each of the dead, Finnish and Soviet alike, in a forest still scarred by the fighting, marking the place where an entire army was swallowed by a road in a winter. On the Raate Road, an army was destroyed because it could not leave the ground it was trapped on. Next time on WARFRONT, we follow a force that chose the ground it died on, ordered to hold a position to the last so that others could get away. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to WARFRONT and the next battle will find you.